I want to start by talking about a recent attack at a synagogue in Manchester by a man called Jihad. He killed two, or actually I think he killed one Jewish person, and there was another fatality because of the police, an accidental shooting. What do you think this attack says about Britain today?
It's grim, isn't it? I mean, we're literally importing jihadis into the UK. I think sometimes it's helpful to take a step back from the content of your Twitter feed and maybe even cast an eye over a period of time before there was even Twitter. It's now nearly a quarter of a century since a group of terrorists flew airplanes into the Twin Towers in New York. And that means it's now a quarter of a century since the issue of Islamism in the West and the compatibility or otherwise between the two has been an unavoidable subject. Since that time, a lot of effort and thought has gone into the geopolitics of containing Islamism, with American involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. But there seems to be almost a complete unwillingness in the 25 years since that terrible day in 2001, a complete unwillingness in the West to ask some of the implications about what it means in the West, the compatibility of Islamism and the West in the West. Now, what happened the other day in Manchester was appalling. It's the first time in hundreds of years in Britain where Jewish people have been killed for being Jewish. I mean, that has happened tragically in European countries, but in Britain that simply hadn't happened since the Middle Ages, and yet this is now happening in the UK. But I don't think we should make the mistake of thinking this is some sort of isolated incident. It's only an isolated incident if we choose to forget reality. I did a bit of research before coming on the show, and there have been dozens of similar incidents. There was the Parsons Green attempt when a man called Ahmed Hassan tried to blow up an underground train. He was an import from Iraq. Then, of course, there was the Manchester Arena atrocity a few years before that, where 20-something, largely teenage girls, were murdered by a man called Salman Abedi, whose parents were from Libya. I could go on. There's the Derby terrorist, which mercifully failed, a man called Munir Mohammed, an import from Sudan, who tried to commit atrocities. Then there was the London Bridge attacker, Rashid Rudani, I think you call him, who killed 8 people in 2017, an import from North Africa. We seem to have these incidents and then somehow forget them. But actually, if you join the dots, we've had a consistent problem of importing or allowing in to the country people like the suspect in Manchester, who came to this country, I believe it was in 2006, as a child from Syria. They come into this country. They have values and belief systems that are incompatible with Western cultural norms, and then they lash out and commit these terrible atrocities. We need to wake up. We need to recognize that there is a serious problem here. I don't think what happened in Manchester the other day was an isolated incident. It is a consistent pattern, and it's a pattern that our governments are choosing not to recognize and act on.
Jihad al-Shami, this is the Manchester murderer. He was on bail for an alleged rape as well. What do you think that says about our justice system? Because a lot of these people are actually on, the prevent watch list. I don't think Jihad was, but for example, Axel Radabakana, the man who murdered all those little girls at the Taylor Swift dance class last year, he was on the prevent watch list. A lot of these people are actually already in the judicial system. Do you think that our judicial system is failing in that way?
Oh, I think the judicial system is clearly dysfunctional. It clearly doesn't apply justice, and the justice it does apply is clearly sort of arbitrary. I mean, it's frankly absurd that this man, whose literal name means holy warrior from Syria, was allowed into the UK, and then having been allowed out on bail, committed this terrible crime. But I think after we get these incidents, we make this terrible mistake of of almost blaming the security services. And people say, what more could have been done? And there was a report after the Manchester Arena atrocity where people said, what more should have been done? Look, there are currently something like 40,000 Islamists on the security services watch list. The sheer number of potential Islamist terrorists that have been allowed into the country legally and illegally over the past few years probably means that 40,000 figure could well increase. I just don't think in a free Western society you can endlessly add to the thousands of people that the security services have to monitor and track. And I don't think it's realistic to then say the security services either failed to have these people on their watch list or failed to track them on their watch list. I mean, at some point you need to recognize that maybe our security lies not in MI5 and MI6 tracking people, but in us keeping the people who they would track were they here out of the country and removing from the country those who cause these problems. I mean, I've been really struck since what happened in Manchester a few weeks ago. There's been very little discussion, if any, about what mosque did this young man go to? Which imams did he listen to? Who were his co-religionists? These are the conversations we need to have. And it would be naive of us to think that someone in Whitehall is having these discussions. I don't think they have been having these discussions. We need, I think, to recognize that there is a pattern here, and that perhaps what we need to do is be far more proactive in identifying people who are at risk and removing them from the country before the chance of them ever committing an atrocity like this comes to pass.
The reaction of the British state and many people across the political spectrum to these terrorist attacks has been summed up with the title of one song, Don't Look Back in Anger, from Oasis. And this is what they constantly tell the public is we must unite after these attacks, we mustn't get angry, we mustn't be bigots, we mustn't attack groups and so on. This is an opportunity to reflect and to be harmonious and sort of come together as a community. What do you make of this reaction that actually don't be angry about this, don't be angry, it's time to come together and it's all peace and love?
I think the people we should be angry with are the British state who failed to change and adapt to this very real threat. The primary purpose of a state, going back to the formation of states in the early modern period, is that they protect their citizens, and the state is obviously failing to do that. Clearly, people within the upper echelons of the British state regard managing the reaction of ordinary Britons to these atrocities as a higher priority than actually addressing the root cause of this problem. And we see this. Clearly, there are plans in place to manage public opinion in the wakes of atrocities like this. The upper echelons of the police and probably the College of Policing have protocols in place clearly where they try and respond according to a playbook. The delays in releasing information about the suspects in the wake of attacks like this. There are then clearly attempts to emphasize things that detract public opinion from the conclusions the public would otherwise draw. I think the state officials that play these games are playing very, very, very dangerous games. Clearly, managing public opinion is not going to work if you have a persistent pattern. These are not lone wolf attacks. These are persistent attacks that are being made by people with an agenda. You could perhaps get away with the idea that the public should not look back in anger and sit around kumbaya and light candles for a while. But can you continue to do that when on the streets of Britain, week in, week out, large numbers of people come out and support a terrorist group, Hamas, that clearly is in the business of wanting to attack Jewish people? I mean, Hamas 2 years ago went and massacred large numbers of Jewish people in Israel. Can you really pretend that the sympathy for that Islamist ideology and agenda is consigned to a handful of bad apples who commit these atrocities when you get large numbers of people coming out and supporting Hamas, a terrorist organization? So, I think we need to have a bit of honesty and integrity from the British state. We need to recognize that these are not just a few bad apples, a few Islamist radicals that need to be contained. There is a genuine problem of Islamism, that is not Islam, but of Islamism in the West. We need to address it. It's not just about a few individuals. It's not even about the 40,000 people on the security services watch list. It is a bigger problem than that. and it requires us to have a strategy for dealing with it that is robust, that is preemptively aggressive in removing people from the country. And if we don't do this, we will end up in a very dark place. I can't be the only person in the Western world that doesn't want to share my country and my society with Hamas supporters. I think most people in Britain and America and the West will not want to share their country with Hamas supporters. Therefore, we need to begin to implement policies that make sure that we don't share our country with Hamas supporters. Instead, the state has run PR programs and, frankly, demonized and picked on a handful of people hot-headed people who perhaps have said things online they shouldn't have said and perhaps behaved lawlessly at protests. Look, that is not a successful strategy for containing this problem. If we want to avert a serious calamity, we need a British state that is honest at the time of these atrocities, recognizes the fundamental incompatibility between Islamism and the West, and begins to address the underlying cause of the problem, which is not angry nativist Britons putting up flags because they're angry about this. The root cause of the problem is that we've allowed into the country a whole bunch of people who share an ideology with a man called Sayyid Qutb, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, who wrote a manifesto for radical reform called Milestones. He published it a generation or two ago. And we need to identify people who share that ideology and remove them from the West. If we don't do that, we will head to a very, very brutal, grim, dark place.
After this terrible attack in Manchester, David Lammy, the Deputy Prime Minister of the UK, he was giving a speech at a memorial service and some local people heckled him, particularly criticising the Labour Party position on Israel-Palestine, supporting, the Palestinian cause against the Israelis, with this group of people who obviously believe that Israel is committing some kind of genocide in Gaza and so on. Do you think that the Labour government, in appeasing these pro-Palestine and some people who are pro-Hamas, this group, is enabling anti-Semitism, is enabling the kind of attack that we saw last week?
I saw that. I saw David Lammy speak in front of that group of, I think, largely Jewish British citizens, and the anger was palpable. It was slightly reminiscent of a video I remember seeing as a young man when Nicolae Ceausescu, the former dictator of Romania, gave a speech and the crowd started jeering, and the look of sort of disbelief on his face when the fantasy narrative that he had been peddling for years clearly met with reality. And we saw David Lammy's fantasy Kumbaya, let's all light candles narrative meet reality. And you could see on his face this expression of disbelief. He simply doesn't have the ideological, intellectual solutions to today's problems. He has no credibility. He knows it. The crowd knows it. And what was fascinating is the look on his face as he knew that the crowd knew it, that he was out of his depth. If the British state and the officials at the upper echelons of the British state are out of their depth, then I think we have a problem. It's extraordinary that only a few weeks before, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, clearly in concert with the Prime Minister of Canada and I think the Prime Minister of Australia and a handful of other countries, had obviously decided, and I think the French President had decided in concert to recognize Palestine. Clearly there's some sort of orchestrated effort by the deep state in all those countries to do this. I think it's notable that America hasn't joined in that effort. I do think it is obviously quite offensive to Jewish people who see that an organization, Hamas, that has targeted and killed people in Israel because they're Jewish, is being rewarded in this way. And now we see the payback. There's no gratitude for recognizing the Palestinian state. There's no sense that somehow we can now begin to reconcile. There's no possibility of what happened in Northern Ireland, which is where one side moves forward an inch and the other side moves forward an inch. In Northern Ireland, it's possible to find a solution with people on the other side simply because they have a price and a rational price, and you can, however painful it might be, find common ground. You can't find common ground with people who want to kill you. You can't find common ground with people, if you're an Israeli, who want to exterminate the state of Israel. And we can't find common ground with people who live in Western societies who share that ideology and share that goal and share that ambition. Because make no mistake about it, if you share an ideology that wants to exterminate Israel, you're also in bed ideologically with people who will then want to exterminate the West. Israel is basically the canary in the Western coal mine. If Israel gets into trouble, the people who wish Israel ill are not going to be friends of you and me, Stephen. They're not going to be reconciled to the Western way of life. Israel will be first in a long march, and we need to wake up and recognize this.
I want to talk about some statistics from an opinion poll done by the Henry Jackson Society after October 7th of British Muslims. It found that just one in four British Muslims believed that Hamas committed murder and rape against Israeli citizens on October 7th. Almost half of British Muslims said that Jews have too much power over UK government policy. British Muslims are more likely to have a positive view than a negative view of Hamas, which is obviously a proscribed terrorist organisation. Nearly half of British Muslims would back the removal of an MP if they took a different stance on Israel and Palestine to them. 52% want to make it illegal to show a picture of the Prophet Muhammad, and 32% of British Muslims favour the implementation of Sharia law, and the same number the declaration of Islam as the national religion. What do you make of these extraordinary figures that showing that vast numbers of British Muslims, and we're talking about millions of people here, either support terrorist organisations, support the implementation of Sharia law or Islam as the official religion of Britain, and have extremely odd views on whether Hamas actually committed terror and murder and rape on October 7th?
It's deeply depressing, isn't it? And it must be, spare a thought for how depressing it must be if you are a British Muslim who lives quietly, obeys the law, believes and follows their faith, but not in an extremist way, and wants to get on as a fully integrated member of British society. It must be profoundly depressing for those sorts of people to find that many of their co-religionists, frankly, share an ideology with an extremist terrorist organization. But I haven't seen the data, but I suspect that if you broke the data down by age and demographically, it would probably, I think, be even more depressing, because I think it would probably show that second, third, and fourth generation Muslims born in Britain, far from renouncing some of these beliefs, actually were more prone to support Sharia law and more prone to extremist views towards Hamas. One of the problems we've got in the West is that we have allowed people with an Islamist ideology to radicalize second and third and fourth generation Muslims in a way that no government in the Muslim world would tolerate. It's quite striking, I think, to ask the question, would the government of the United Arab Emirates or the government of Egypt or the government of Jordan tolerate the radicalization of young people in their countries, the way that we have turned a blind eye to the radicalization of young Muslims in our countries? So I think we need a strategy that I had always assumed after the September 11th attacks 25 years ago, that someone in the deep state would be thinking about this, but clearly they haven't been. Clearly no one has been addressing the issue. How do we deal with the imams? How do we deport the imams? How do we cut off the sources of funding that allow the expansion of mosques and radical Salafist ideology in the West? And how do we make sure that young Muslims in Britain increasingly integrate with British society? What seems to be happening is the very opposite of that. We seem to have a situation where the longer and the more generations that pass, the less integrated and the more radicalized. As I said, I don't think any Arab government would tolerate this in their countries. They understand the real danger of radical, unchecked Islamist ideology. We now need in the West to recognize that we mustn't allow Western liberalism to allow this virus to run free. If it does, we will incubate it and it will bite us. So yeah, I think it's deeply depressing. But don't be angry with Muslims. Don't be angry with Islam. Be angry with the failures of the British state that have allowed radicals to radicalize unchecked. That is the real issue that we face. What is it that every government we've had over the past 20 years done about this? At the moment, what they've done seems to be the sum of very little.
To what extent does Islam impact or influence British politics today?
Clearly, you've got a block vote in some seats. I think they returned 5 or 6 members of parliament on the supposed Gaza ticket. What I think is perhaps more alarming is not just that they were able to win Islamist MPs, or I should say Muslim MPs, were able to win seats on a Gaza ticket by appealing to clearly a sort of ethno-nationalist issue. Actually, maybe that's not fair. Maybe it's more of a religious nationalist issue. I don't think it's necessarily an ethnic issue. It's a religious ideological issue. It's an important distinction to make. What's even more depressing than that is that there were a whole range of seats where actually some of these challengers on the Gaza ticket came very close to unseating particularly Labour MPs. And I think what we're beginning to see now is the Labour Party panicking. They're clearly unpopular. They're not doing very well. And they're looking to the next election, and they realize that they're in grave danger of losing a whole raft of seats, not just to reform, but because a lot of their traditional supporters might vote for a so-called Gaza ticket MP or candidate. And I think it's because of this panic that we now see the Labour Party beginning to pander to some of those pro-Hamas Gaza constituents. I think this probably explains why ministers on the very day, or the week, I should say, of the atrocity in Manchester, I noticed that a Labour minister tweeted out that a cohort of Gazan students had been allowed to settle in the West. Now, either the minister who did that is extraordinarily tin-eared and has no judgment about politics, or he does have a judgment about politics, and he's playing a very dangerous game of deliberately signaling to pro-Gaza ticket voters in those constituencies that Labour is on their side. Either way, it's a remarkably foolish thing for him to have done within hours of this atrocity in Manchester.
We did see some people celebrate the October 7th attacks straight after they happened across the West. And the 2-year anniversary happened just a few days ago. Again, we saw people out there protesting against Israel in favor of Palestine, even on that day, the anniversary of those terrible massacres. But there is also good news. It looks like there's some kind of peace agreement between Hamas and the Israelis that's about to be enacted. First of all, what do you make of these people celebrating? And second of all, just some thoughts on this peace agreement and what do you think about that?
I mean, I'm a free speech absolutist. I think unless you're actually doing something or protesting something or saying something that directly incites violence, I think if you want to be a jerk, you have the freedom to be a jerk. But I think we should call them out for being jerks. It was extraordinarily crass, frankly, on the second anniversary of the terrible terrorist attacks in Israel to be out on the streets protesting. I mean, we should see it for what it is, a utterly repulsive thing to do. I don't want to share my country with people who behave like that. I think it's absolutely repulsive. But I don't think the answer is to somehow try to ban slogans or ban flags or to ban umbrella protest groups. I mean, I think that's a ludicrous game to play. I worry. I don't worry so much about Israel. In the 2 years since Israel was attacked, Israel has actually shown extraordinary resilience. They've essentially taken out the threat to their north, Hezbollah. They have prevailed in Gaza, and hopefully the hostages will be released. I suspect that Israel will get the return of the hostages, and I suspect that they're getting what they want because Hamas is not in great shape. Israel has actually rallied over the past 2 years, and with that extraordinary sense of purpose that Israelis have, begun to find ways of actually strengthening their overall strategic position. I don't worry about Israel. I worry about the West. In the 2 years since those attacks, the West has actually failed to do the things we need to do to address the problems on our own streets. So, it's the West that is in dire straits and that lacks moral purpose and courage to address its Islamist problem. Israel has recognized its Islamist problem and is dealing with it remarkably effectively.
Douglas Carswell, thank you so much for joining us.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stephen.